Thank you. And as we're getting started here, I just want to welcome everybody to the chat today. You guys are in for a treat. We have Dr. Heather George and Dr. Brian Gaunt on with you today, and they are going to be presenting on using your data effectively, a school-based approach. So I'm sure you guys will really enjoy it. And with that, I am going to turn it over to Dr. George to get us started.
Thanks, Betsy. Good afternoon, everybody. Let me see why this isn't. Here we go. My name is Heather George. I'm excited to talk to you guys about effectively using your data. And so when Brian and I designed this presentation, we were thinking traditionally around the schools in mind. So even if you're district support staff, we know that you are constantly supporting the folks out there in the schools. So if we've got school level staff, hopefully you're able to take this right away and start to use your data to make decisions on your campuses. But the goal is that regardless of wherever you're coming from, whether it's district level, state level, school level, that understanding what we need to do to make decisions for overall improvement is going to be helpful for everybody, whether we're making those exact changes in our implementation or we're supporting folks in that implementation process. But we know that implementation is not something that happens overnight. We've got to start somewhere. And oftentimes what we're seeing that first 1 to 2 years when we're learning something new and starting to engage in implementation, it requires us to establish that core. And since we're talking about PBIS, it's establishing those core foundational elements like your expectations, your clear procedures and rules across your campuses, your clear data system that you've got set up, using your data for decision making and evaluating along the way. But essentially, though, we know that if not everybody comes on board with what we're doing at the core, it can slow that process down. But that typically are some of the things that we're dealing with. It's trying to get that system up in place, trying to make our procedures work more efficiently, work smarter for us, and then trying to not only keep our stakeholders on board, but also trying to help others to understand why it's important that we are doing things or trying to do things a new way to prevent problem behavior so that we can get the most impact and outcomes with kids through the academics and the social emotional and behavioral as well. But it requires us to constantly, we just don't put it into place and then consider it done. I always like to look at implementation somewhat as a marriage. You just don't get married and then you don't ever have to talk to your spouse again. We know how those types of things work out. We get married and we've got to continue working on it. So we engage in this systems change process and we've got to continue to work and be mindful of what the critical elements are, using our data not only from how we're doing with our Fidelity of our implementation, but also our students responding to how we're implementing with Fidelity and what's the impact of those outcomes. And that's that constant monitoring process, because using that data as we're going allows us to make changes along the way. And using that action plan is essentially our accountability aspect of it, but it also helps us kind of stay on the path, keeps reminding us what we're doing. It's a living document in that for those of us that like to do lists and we like to cross things off, and we always know that there's something new to go on there, or we always know like, okay, based on about how something went with the day or how I thought things would be set up, I need to change it slightly. So it's important to have this living document that is constantly being updated as you're going, because you're using your data, reflecting on how things are going and how they're responding. So it's not an easy process, it's an ongoing process. But as you guys know, is that just a quick reminder, our goals overall at PBIS is we want to build those effective, positive school environments because we want to increase the school safety so that students can improve their academic, behavioral, and I'm going to add in their social emotional outcomes. And that means for everybody. In order to do that, we're going to have to prevent and reduce problem behaviors by working together as a team, collaborating, and using our data and that assessment-based approach for developing effective instruction and interventions. So therefore, we're going to have to teach what we're expecting for behaviors, and we're going to have to reinforce those appropriate behaviors when they're displayed in order to enhance that social emotional learning so that students can then understand, okay, if I do this in a positive way, I may get this. And it helps them to be able to take that out into the world. It's a great life skill, obviously, but we need to also get good at how we're delivering that across a multi-tiered system of supports, because not all kids are going to get it with just our basic core instruction. Some are going to need a little bit more assistance and support along the way. And how we're going to do that is we're going to make sure that we are using our data to make those decisions, like these circles in the right top corner are showing, examining our practices in order to best improve our systems. And our outcomes that we're getting from there will help us determine, are we making differences within our systems overall? What do we need to change within our practices? What do our data show us about what's happening with practices being used or potentially not being used, and how is that impacting our overall system? And therefore, what do we need to do differently to change our system so that we can start to realize those outcomes that we want to see? But we've got to do this not only through using data, but we've got to have a team to be able to do that. We know in the research on school-wide positive behavior support that it works. We also know you implement with Fidelity, you will can realize, and through all of this research across the last 20 plus years, that people that implement with Fidelity, they have improved student outcomes from a range from everything from academic performance to reducing bullying behaviors. They're increasing their social emotional competence. There's decreased rates of student-reported drug and alcohol abuse. They're also reducing their exclusionary discipline, including office discipline referrals, suspensions, as well as restraints and seclusion. But the plus side happens to be for the adults. It's not just the kids that are benefiting. There's actually improved teacher outcomes too that have been shown in the research, that there's improved perception of teacher efficacy, school organizational health and school climate, and as well as a perception of school safety, which is huge. But again, it doesn't just happen magically. It requires a team to be working together and adhering to those critical elements that we've got established and that we're working hard to implement with Fidelity. So talking about how you're using your data, that's essentially falling under the category of evaluation. And so I always think it's important to start back, like, what are we talking about when we're talking about data, talking about evaluation? That overall, I think it's important for folks to understand that the purpose of evaluation is to examine how teams are accurately selecting and implementing their PBIS systems and practices. So using our data for that to determine, did we use the right interventions for this? It helps us, allows us as a team to focus on the student outcomes and figure out what we need to target. So if we've got students or classes that are not responding as well with our basic core instruction, what do we need to do differently with those folks or those settings in order for them to be more successful? And it's also going to help us looking at that data overall to determine if teams are accurately and consistently implementing the activities and practices as they've specified in their individualized action plan. So this is my colleague, Kent McIntosh, who has done a extensive research study across thousands of schools across the country. And what he wanted to know is, what was it about schools that continued to realize positive student outcomes and were continuing to sustain PBIS long term? And here were the main areas. The first one was that they were keeping a strong team. The second one was that they were using their fidelity of implementation data to improve their systems. So for you guys, if you've used any type of fidelity tools, such as the benchmarks quality, for our folks in Texas, they may refer to it as the BOQ. There's also the tiered fidelity inventory, also known as the TFI. But those scores and that information that's derived from there helps determine what they're going to be adding to their action plan to continue to improve their system. Another thing that they found is that schools that continue to sustain and achieve those or maintain positive student outcomes is that they were using their school discipline data. And another thing, that they moved that implementation across the school-wide effort, but really started to implement deeply in the classroom. So I think this works out perfectly because our whole goal of talking to you guys today is about how we're using our data. And this is something we can learn from schools across the country that continue to sustain PBIS long-term, realize those outcomes. The 2 out of the 4 main things is they're using their Fidelity data to improve their system. They're continuing to use their school discipline data. They clearly were working together as a team, and then they moved into their classrooms to best impact their teachers and their students directly. All right, so let's move into using our data for action planning, because essentially if we're just collecting data and not using it to change our practices and what we're doing, it's just going to become a paperwork task whatsoever. So we really want to be able to be using it to make those changes. So let's talk about, are your data useful and for what? And so you think about overall, your data sources should help you identify the needs to help you determine the goals. So if your goal is, I want to decrease the amount of disruption that I'm having in my classroom, you've got to identify what the need is. Well, what's happening in the classroom? Why is this occurring? So you're going to define what you need to do, which is the first step in the problem-solving process. Your data sources should also help you analyze what you need to do, which is basically help you understand what are those barriers to you reaching those goals. That's the second step in the problem-solving process. The third is talking about providing sufficient information to select, match, and deliver those services or supports. This is where we've taken our data, we've realized why are we having these issues. We've then been able to carefully select interventions that might be better in addressing some of the problems that we're having. And that helps us determine these are the interventions, therefore this is what we're going to do or implement, which is the third step in the problem-solving process. And finally, then contributes to evaluating the effectiveness of services and supports provided. That fourth step in the problem-solving process is then evaluating and using our data for decision-making. And you can see in the top right-hand corner, we've got the whole multi-tiered framework there, where the green is your core instruction overall for what you're doing, either for academics and or for behavior. But you know that not all kids respond equally. And the goal is we set up clear processes and procedures. Then it's easier to be able to use our data to determine which kids need, or some kids need a little bit more support. And then what are those few kids that need the most intensive support at this school setting? All right, so let's move a little bit more into database problem solving, and Brian's going to go into specific graphs and show you what the data look like and show you some of those guiding questions along the way. But like I said, here are the 4-step problem solving process of identifying what's the problem, why is it occurring, what are we going to do about it, and essentially evaluate, is it working? So those 4 main questions or the 4 main steps within the problem solving process are outlined here. And then these are some of the guiding questions that can assist you throughout each step of the process. So it's finding and being able to determine what problems are occurring most often, when and where are they occurring, who's involved with this, helps us identify the overall problem. Once we identify that, and hopefully it's accurate, it isn't always all the time, which requires us to go back through the process. Then we want to look at step 2 in the problem analysis, such as why are they occurring, and help us to determine what's the purpose behind it. Again, if you've got lots of disruption, say that's happening in the cafeteria, and you're able to narrow it down and say we're having the most problems in the cafeteria, you might want to say, why is this most often happening? Sometimes we find out, well, we forgot to teach the kids what the expectations were in the cafeteria, or we haven't taught them it in a long time, and we haven't had active supervision in there. So what are we going to do about it? Our third step is getting into, all right, what do we need to do for an antecedent, the behavior, and the consequences? So these are those interventions you come up with, which might be, we're going to put more people in the cafeteria, and we're going to make sure to go through and teach the kids, and we're going to try to catch them and correct them quickly if they're not following the rules with that, and maybe acknowledge them when they are following them. And then based on that, we're going to use our data and determine, did that make a difference to help curb the issues that we were having in that particular area? So like I said, Brian will go through some of the more specifics in just a minute. But this document that we've got here was on the Florida our Florida PSRTI site on guiding to tools for instructional problem solving, and it just is a really nice resource to provide some additional information about some guiding principles about meeting the needs of all students and helping to make those connections with practices that are occurring, as well as engaging in that problem solving process. So essentially, when we're talking about managing the scope of the problem, we've got to think about what are these barriers that are affecting the student, because that essentially what catches our attention often is the behavior that may occur, and a lot of times it's the problematic behavior that occurs. So we've got to think about what are those behaviors affecting the student. But if we step back and we're analyzing data, we also need to look at, are there additional barriers that are specific to a classroom, like a specific class, a grade level of students? Because we may need to say, it may not be that it's a lot of students, they may be all coming from the same area. And that might help us to determine where we're going to be focusing our intervention. However, we also might need to look at, are there any barriers that are affecting an entire school? It might be that we need to go in and reteach everything or establish a clear expectations, reinforce it and acknowledge it as we're going, because everybody could benefit. But you can also use data to look at the district level as well, which is essentially our organizational problem solving. You know, what are the barriers that might be affecting all schools? So you can see that regardless of where we are in the problem solving process, there are data that can be pulled from all different areas to help us determine how can we address these barriers and make improvements so that people can be successful. So let's move in a little bit to the data analysis and evaluation for school level tier 1 supports. So some of the keys to achieving a supportive school community and how to use your data during monthly team meetings is, it's important, as we know, we talk about stakeholder engagement, sometimes it's referred to as buy-in, but it's a continual refinement of those systems level support. So we've got to think about, based upon our data that we're doing with the benchmarks of quality, if you're using the TFI, but anything related to additional data around Fidelity, maybe your climate data, where and how are you guys doing with that? Let your stakeholders know about that. And so these resources can be found on our Florida website. But from this information that you're gathering from your stakeholders, informing stakeholders, it also helps us so we can take this and be able to make changes overall. So discipline data used with other data sources can help us design implementation strategies. So we may come up with and realize we don't have a clear discipline referral process, and our data may show, you know what, we're getting all kinds of different things from teachers filling things out. That may help us determine, you know what, our Fidelity data were showing we weren't implementing this section well, but also when we look at our actual data that are coming in, there's all kinds of ranges in how people are filling things out. So that can help us determine how we're going to make changes within implementing on that school campus. I think one way we like to think about it, I think when folks talk about Fidelity, I always like to think of the an example around a surgeon. You know, when you're going on into, say, open heart surgery or something, you want to make sure that that person not only has been trained, but is clear on what the procedures and protocols are that have been established for the success of that surgery. And you're putting a lot of trust in their hands for that. So one way that we could look at this is that the independent variable may be the medication or some type of treatment, okay, that is being provided to you because it's been shown that if you take this medication based upon whatever issue, that it is going to be able to treat it. It's going to be able to take care of it. And the dependent variable is essentially what you're doing and examining how well are your symptoms improving. Okay, now let's look at it as PBIS. Essentially, your independent variable is the practices, the components that you're putting into place there. Are you making sure to engage in those practices? It's just as similar as, are you continuing to take your medication? Are you continuing to go to physical therapy and type of thing? Depending on how well you are continuing to engage in your practices, your dependent variable is going to determine your student outcomes. And so your dependent variable is going to be whether you're able, if you are improving your student outcomes or not. You can see how these are all connected together. So I think it's important that we need to look at education and what we're doing for setting up our PBIS systems, implementing our PBIS practices within our campuses and across our districts, that they need to be treated importantly. They need to know that they are evidence-based and that we do see the results when we work to implement them as they were originally intended, which is the definition of fidelity. So effective data systems for behavior, just two things I wanted to point out to you. In that PBSES, we've got system level refinement, implementation effectiveness. There's the Florida PBIS evaluation section, and you can go to the PBSES system to find out how to log in for PBS evaluation system. That's where we enter our fidelity data. At the end of the year, we enter our PIC data, our progress monitoring data throughout the year, and you would enter your student outcomes at the end of the year. We also have an RTIB database too, that's a free database for districts, but also for schools, and predominantly for the schools to be able to make those quick, meaningful decisions around tiers 1, 2, and 3. And so if you haven't had a chance to see these, I recommend that you go check out these websites for more information. So I'm going to turn it over to Brian so that he can take you through the specific process.
Great, thank you, Heather. All right, folks. So as Heather was saying, we just want to try to illustrate for you all an opportunity just to see how all these pieces kind of come together and how we can look at the combination of both our fidelity data and our student outcome data to make decisions about how we want to improve the effectiveness or the outcomes of our Tier 1 system for behavior. For many of you, I'm not sure exactly what your prior knowledge or background is on a structured problem-solving process. There are, of course, different models out there. Heather had mentioned before earlier that the model that we use in Florida, there are resources out there to help provide additional learning or opportunities to explore that process. But we will go ahead and provide a model here just to show kind of how this could look at a school level as a school-based leadership team is trying to improve on an annual basis their outcomes for Tier 1 to make it as healthy and as strong as possible for students. So essentially what we're going to be looking at here then are different sources of data, but in a sense we're trying to avoid the individual student focus here. We really want to ascertain in this step 1 for Tier 1, are we dealing with the fish or the water kind of a situation? So if you think about a fish tank with a bunch of fish in it, some of them might be swimming sideways. Historically what we have done in our system is to take those fish out one at a time, send them off to a school psychologist or another student services professional, and begin understanding more about that individual student and develop an individual plan for them. But when we have so many students that are struggling, we really need to address the larger climate and context for what might be resulting in so many students having so many issues with their behavior. So as we think about school-based leadership teams setting themselves up to work with their data, what we recommend is a monthly kind of a meeting schedule where every month they're coming together and they're looking at their patterns and trends of data on a month-to-month basis. Taking that form of approach will allow them to kind of head off areas of concern or gaps in their implementation practices that are occurring during the school year, so that they can make those adjustments rather than waiting to the end of the school year and finding out or realizing the hard way that all their efforts during the year didn't work out. You can think about this in an individual student level, kind of thinking about how you have the summative assessment at the end of the year, which might be the FSA, but during the school year, you have benchmark assessments or other kinds of unit assessments to gauge and monitor whether or not students are on track to perform well on the summative assessment at the end of the year. So for problem identification, we really want to kind of get a sense of where are we in relation to where we want to be. As we think about the tiered logic, typically what we're asking folks to consider is the health of their Tier 1. And so by health, what we're referring to there is the percentage of students that are meeting the expectations or meeting our values for how much we want them to engage in their instruction and their schooling. This is a demonstration right now of some of the reports that you'll be able to access and your schools can access through our new dashboard through the PBSES database system. And this is initially the page that your schools will see when they log in. Up here, you can see where they stand with their BOQ score in the most recent year, their walkthrough information, any information around their TFI results for Tier 2 or Tier 3, as well as you see here in the middle, the school effectiveness report. Up to the right over here, you can see that there are changes in their ODR, ISS, or OSS rates from year to year. And so those can also serve as an indicator for the schools to decide whether or not they need to adjust their priorities in one of these particular sources of data. And this graph here is just a screenshot of a summary of where that school stands right now with regards to risk ratios or disproportionality or equity concerns. So as we get into problem solving, one of the first questions we want to ascertain, of course, then is what really is the health of our Tier 1 system. This is an example here where you see that the school has about 66% of its students having no more than one referral for the year per student. And so where you have 2 or more referrals, then we're looking at students who could potentially require some supplemental supports. But being that we want to have approximately around 80% or more students with no more than one referral during the year, this would be right now an indication for this school that we do in fact need to take a closer look at Tier 1. It's probably not the right time right now to dig into individual students or groups of students for Tiers 2 and 3. Now that doesn't mean that we can't concurrently plan for Tiers 2 and Tier 3 services for some students, but before we get that, we want to make sure we've got a plan in place to improve our Tier 1. This is an example of a screenshot that, again, schools will have access to look at and see how their school's performing. And here what we're trying to look at is essentially the relationship overall, just kind of a bird's eye view of how the school's fidelity data is progressing year after year and how well they're doing with their outcomes. You can see up here to the left, the school can choose the number of years that they want to look at historically. Over here to the right, you can choose the type of outcome you want to look at, whether it's ODRs, ISS, or OSS. This particular graph here up at the top is indicating the number of ODRs per 100 across school years in relation to changes in their fidelity levels year after year. Now this picture that you're looking at here is really a classic example of what you should expect schools to see, that as their fidelity goes up, their problem behavior referrals go down. And when we have a different picture, somewhat like this one, this should be a red flag to schools. Here we're showing that as their fidelity was going down, their outcomes for ODRs were starting to go up. And down here you can see that you can also look at historical trends over their ODR per 100, ISS, and OSS rates. These orange graphs, these orange lines here represent the median of the school type that this school represents, whether it's elementary, middle, or high school, and it's specific to the lowest 25% quartile of schools in Florida that are actively implementing PBIS. So when you have schools that are increasing their ODRs, in this case, they're decreasing their ISS, which is good, but their OSSs is increasing, then this right now just kind of sets the stage for the school team to understand that we do in fact have a Tier 1 issue, and we need to really kind of understand why either our ODR or our suspension rates are increasing, and whether or not that might be related to decreases in our fidelity or low fidelity issues. So we're going to look now basically at a number of different patterns of data. The purpose of problem ID at this point is really just kind of to lay out all the different concerns that we might find in different sources and reports that we can pull. And so right now we're just kind of catalog different trends and different kinds of patterns, and we're going to funnel those down from broad kind of trends over time into more specific current patterns, so that we can then pick out a priority for addressing through problem solving. So one of the best things that we can begin to do with our historical data is just start thinking about, what are our referrals, average daily referrals per day, per month, and to look at, for example, getting ready for, say, a next school year, what are the months during the school year that we typically find spikes in our behavior problems. And so that allows the team to get out ahead of some concerns that might exist in the school that historically explain why we have these particular issues during the months. Another thing that we can do, of course, is again go back to our historical patterns of the different sources of behavior data and look to see if in fact we have increases or decreases in those. Now when a school has increasing trends in ODR OSS rates, that should indicate then that we are certainly missing something in the way we're doing our implementation. Where we have trends that are going down, it's an opportunity for us to take inventory as to why we're having success there. What can we do to keep that success? are there certain practices that we want to maintain and continue to use year after year to get this kind of result? But again, when we have increases, we want to take a closer look to better understand why that's happening. Now, when you look at these OSS rates, for example, going up here, what we don't know right now is exactly how many students are involved in that. But we do know from the previous screen that this is a school whose tier 1 is just not very strong right now. And so certainly want to make sure that we are looking at this for whole population until we get a clear picture as to the different demographic groups that we'll look at next. Going further into the fidelity piece, schools have the option to further dig into their fidelity data. So rather than just simply look at a BOQ score, they can actually look at the different elements of the BOQ. Here in this middle graph to the right, you can see the critical elements for the BOQ. The dotted line would indicate a minimum expectation. And this is an example of a school that right now has a healthy tier 1 as far as their fidelity goes. But they can also use information from their mid-year pick surveys to also monitor the progress or the fidelity quality throughout the school year, and to ensure that there aren't any gaps in those as they become, as they get into the final school year. Now, here's an example of a school in which they have significant components that are very low and below what we want to have minimally in place. And so this is a place where a school can, right from this data, just simply begin to think about, what are the areas or the priorities that we need to focus on for this next school year to increase the fidelity of our tier 1 PBIS? What is it about faculty commitment that we would be rated so low on? Is there anything that we can do to ensure more faculty engagement and buy-in or otherwise participation in the procedures and the practices that we would like them to use? Are there, for example, anything that we need to do to shore up teaching the expectations and the rules in the school? Are there concerns where perhaps in certain areas or locations of the building or perhaps in our classrooms, we're not doing enough to really teach and to support students' understanding of those expectations? We might also find that in some cases, year after year, we have interruptions in the way we run our reward recognition programs. So this is where we can ask ourselves, are the students coming in contact with the reward system or the recognition system? And there are different ways in which you can kind of investigate that. One simple way sometimes is to go to your store where you might have these items for students to purchase with their tokens. And if your personnel who are managing that store are keeping an inventory or an audit list of which students are purchasing and what they're purchasing, we can begin to find out which students are actually coming in contact with the store. And if they're not, then we can make sure that we adjust our tier 1 procedures so that every student has a chance to come in contact with that reward system. Lesson plans typically I find are often a very low indicator on benchmarks of quality results for many schools. But here what we're saying is that the school themselves might not have structured lessons designed for use in either teaching expectations or otherwise teaching socially appropriate behaviors in classrooms and other settings in the school. And then of course, we can also look at whether or not we can build greater tier 1 fidelity by ensuring that we have a focused implementation plan, that we're sharing that with our stakeholders to ensure their participation and buy-in for those pieces. And of course, then the classroom piece, as we saw from Kent McIntosh's slide, that's a very important component for sustainability and effective practices with PBIS. So what can we do at the classroom level to further enhance that those practices are happening with fidelity? So just looking at the BOQ, we can certainly begin to think about some action items that as a school we could take to better include or ensure that we have a high fidelity of our practices at tier 1. Another way to triangulate that is to look at your walkthrough data. So walkthroughs are typically conducted by an agent or a person who's not from the school, who's from outside the school. It could be the district coordinator or a coach, or perhaps maybe even a point of contact from another school. And the value of the walkthrough data is because it's an independent review and it's based on observations with a rubric, we can triangulate between the BOQ, which is a self-report, and this walkthrough data, just how valid some of this information is so that we're acting upon things that truly are a significant concern. So now that we've kind of looked at the overall health of this system and kind of where we stand with our fidelity, at this point as a school, we can say certainly we have some concerns with tier 1. We definitely know we have to address this. And it certainly looks like there might be some pieces in our fidelity of practices that if we fix could help improve some of our outcomes. So now we want to start digging into some patterns around our students' performances. One of the things that we can begin to look at right now is just whether or not our outcomes are equitable for all students. So let's just assume that we're a school that has a healthy tier 1. We have 80% of our students with no more than 1 referral for the year. That might be the case for the total population, but would a healthy tier 1 also be consistent for all the subgroups? And so one of the ways we can attack that is to look at our equitable outcomes for students. So in this school, for example, we're seeing that there are some minor but also some significant concerns when it comes to African-American students' performances with ODRs and OSS. So this would be a place where the school would begin to take note that, as we dig into this tier 1 issue, let's particularly focus in on certain demographic groups that for us are coming up as higher referral rates than the population numbers that they represent at the school. So this becomes a place where we can begin to think about prioritizing certain subgroups, if that's where we feel like the scope of the problem needs to be looking at. In some cases, dealing with the total school environment and making changes that affect all students. Certainly we can improve outcomes for all populations, but what we do find though is that when you take that whole school approach, it may not actually change the equitable ratios or risk ratios that you have for a certain group. In many cases, we have to specifically dig into that specific subgroup to find out what more could we do in addition to the overall tier 1 changes. So knowing that there could be some subgroups that we want to take a closer look at, we also could start to dig into some other data sources to get a sense of some of the patterns of our referrals for this particular month that we're looking at our data. Now, these are reports that you're not going to find in our PBSES system. These are the kinds of reports that you can find through our RTIB database. And so we're going to highlight for you some of those examples and show you how you could use that information to begin developing a priority for problem ID. One of the first things, of course, is to think about, of all the behavior problems that exist in the school, which of them account for the different school expectations that we have. So if we know that the majority of our referrals, about 50% here, are specifically linked to our expectation around being responsible, that could lead to an action step where we decide to reteach for everyone in the building what it means to be responsible and provide more direct and explicit instruction and performance feedback to help students to better align with that expectation. So we're going to look at this case right now, what's the #1 problem behavior we have in the school? For this particular school, they're identifying inappropriate displays of affection and disrespect and technology violation as the top 3 concerns at this school. And so knowing that those are the top 3 behavior concerns, those could be a place for prioritizing problem solving. We can also look at our CESAR events and look at not just the major or minor kinds of referrals that we get at the school level, but we could also look at high incidence, crisis management kinds of issues, or otherwise no tolerance behaviors that we need to address. So here at this school, the majority of the referrals are related to specifically tobacco. And so that could be a place where this school realizes, we really need to dig into where the tobacco use is occurring on campus and begin to make some environmental changes in those locations to prevent further tobacco use during school hours. Another pattern we could look at are times of the day. Now, sometimes times of the day certainly jump out as places that we could look to intervene. Sometimes though, depending on the type of school, for example, secondary, it might be a little bit messier. But when patterns jump up, it gives us a place to start asking some further questions. So what is it about our morning time when students are arriving on campus, or during lunch, or during during maybe after school programs or dismissal, that might be causing students to engage in more disruptive behaviors? One of the first things that we might notice, for example, about these 3 different times of the day is this is when students are engaged in more unstructured types of activities that could set the stage for misbehavior. Another focus that we could do is to look at the grade levels. Now, obviously, we don't have schools that are K through 12 typically, but knowing the grade levels you have for your school, we could look to see, do we want to prioritize a particular grade level that's demonstrating a higher amount of referrals that contributes to our total amount? We could also look at referrals by location. If we know that the majority of referrals are coming from the classroom, we might decide to focus specifically on the behaviors that are occurring in classrooms and then thinking about hypotheses that are classroom specific. You know, what is it about the classroom environments that might lead to a lot of kids being disruptive or otherwise engaging in problem behaviors in the classroom? And when we do think about classrooms specifically, understand though that if we target classroom as a location, we're targeting all referrals in the classroom location. So that could be for a lot of different types of behaviors. So one of the things you can do with our RTIB database is you can actually cross-reference these types of sources. So we can look at classroom referrals by specific problem behavior type. And in this example, what we're seeing is that disruption is the overall highest concern when it comes to classroom referrals. And then we can see also too, looking at the grade level distribution, that this is a concern that exists across all grade levels. And it accounts for about almost a third of the total ODRs of the school. So looking at data this way can allow the team to think about, you know what, let's not just look at classroom referrals in general, but let's specifically target disruption in classrooms and start to get at understanding why those disruptions might be occurring. And so one of the other things too that we sometimes hear stakeholders ask about is, you know, whether or not it's just a high flyer kind of a situation at the school, or if we're dealing with a lot of other kids and teachers. And so as we mentioned before about the quality of your tier one, we want to make sure that that the majority of students are benefiting from PBIS by having no more than one referral for the year. And so a graph like this certainly could help us to see that we're dealing with a lot of different students that might need some supports. Perhaps for tier two, but also in conjunction with the changes we make at tier one. Looking at referrals by staff also gives us a pattern to understand if there are certain classrooms that we would like to target as a priority. In some cases, we might find that certain, let's say, self-contained classrooms are specifically resulting in the majority of our referrals at the school. And so if we just tackle that one classroom, we can reduce our overall referrals that way. We can look at administrative decisions to see whether or not, if we have increasing trends, for example, in our ODRs and suspension rates, are these consequences really having any impact? You'll notice here that in this school example, out-of-school suspensions and detention are the top 2 and 3 kinds of consequences that are given to students. So if we're giving lots of suspensions and detentions, but our referral rates still keep going up, we have to ask whether or not these consequences are really working for us. And when looking at specifically the classroom context, we can also look at the types of activities that are occurring within our RTIB database. In this case, that would help us to further generate hypotheses around what we can do for action planning. So if we know that the majority of disruption referrals in the classroom are specifically occurring during large group instruction, we can then specifically focus and pinpoint large group instruction variables to get a sense of what that context is doing and why it might be resulting in increased disruptions behaviors. This slide here is really just kind of taking us between that tier 1, tier 2 realm. So assuming, of course, we've gone down the path of developing a plan to improve our tier 1 efforts, we might then come back to looking at specific students to think about how to apply tier 2 services to support them. And this is where understanding the function of the student's behavior for that behavior concern they're presenting could help us to lead to decisions around what kinds of treatments to provide. We can also look at specifically how well our tier 2 interventions are working when using our RTIB database. So as you're plugging in the progress monitoring data for specifically tier 2 services, in this case, providing interventions to students for all intervention types, we see 5 students here in which we could make decisions about whether or not these interventions are in fact working for these students or if we need to make modifications to get better results. So all this to say, and in the sake of time, I'm just going to kind of advance right now to the problem analysis step here, is that at that problem ID level, we really want to get at all of these different possible patterns and concerns that we might see in our data and wrestle with which of those we want to make into a priority. There's an old adage that I'm sure some of you are probably aware of. It's that idea of how do you eat an elephant? And of course, the answer is one piece at a time. So in many cases, we often have too many problems that can be addressed at the same time, and it wouldn't be efficient or effective to use all of our resources in that way. But if we pick one problem in particular and really work on a solution towards that, then we continue to take care of one piece at a time as we improve our tier 1 quality. So having addressed and developed a priority in problem ID and developed a statement to define that problem in measurable terms, now we're in a place to really start thinking about some hypotheses. So for example, if we were thinking about why would, let's say 60% of our classroom referrals be for disruption, what is it about that instructional environment that might be resulting in disruptive behaviors? So this is where we want to really get at, why is the problem occurring? Why are these referrals coming from these locations or these times of day or from these activities? And why is it involving these students or these teachers or these classrooms? So we're going to look for barriers that might be preventing students from meeting those Tier 1 expectations. Certainly we want to know something about their motivation, and in many cases it's an assumption that we have in the referrals that have been documented. But in other cases we could also again go back to our fidelity. Let's take a look at how well we're actually implementing Tier 1, because if we're not implementing those components, just like that medical analogy, then that might be really the first go-to to consider. We can probably improve classroom behaviors if we shore up some of these fidelity components in our BOQ or our Tier 1 for PBIS. So in this problem analysis step of hypothesis development, this is really where the team is just going to start brainstorming a lot of different ideas. Why are these referrals happening from this place, this location, involving this population? And we might find, for example, that, for example, smoking in the parking lot, there isn't a lot of visibility or monitoring, or maybe there aren't a lot of signals in that environment to prevent kids from engaging in that behavior. Perhaps there's inadequate supervision that we need to adjust and make available so that we can limit, the problem behavior that's occurring during, for example, hallways during transitions. Maybe we need to do a better job of creating and delivering lesson plans that teach the Tier 1 expectations of being responsible and being safe so that we can reduce those referrals. Perhaps students haven't practiced the behavior enough or received enough feedback on how to do that well with fluency. We might consider that there are consequences that are happening in the school that are reinforcing certain behaviors. For example, some kids may just simply want to go home as a result of the behavior problem. And so OSS doesn't represent punishment to them, it represents a reward. Students, for example, might not also be reinforced for following expectations. So that might be a breakdown in our reward recognition system. And we can find evidence of that if we go to our BOQ and find that that particular component is low. So looking at these different hypotheses at this point, we want to now begin to think about how do we assess whether these are true or not. Again, we can look at existing data, or we can collect new information to begin to understand which of these ideas might actually be valid. And we want to select the ones that we have evidence to support are true, because those are the ones then that we're going to use to build our plan around. Before I move on to the third step of problem solving, I want to just highlight, though, as you think about classroom variables in particular, there are additional variables that we might have to consider, and this is where the integration of academics and behavior really becomes important for understanding. There's a lot to say about the importance of students and teachers being healthy and being mentally healthy and ready and prepared for learning. And that sets the stage, of course, for classroom climate, with the relationships with each other. We have learning standards for academic performance, and there are implied engagement behaviors that students should have prerequisite skills to do in order to meet those standards. We have instructional frameworks that teachers are very well versed in that set the stage for what best practices we're going to use to provide academic instruction. But then at that point now, all we have is set the stage for an environment where now teachers can build lesson plans, deliver those with fidelity, and then look at the impacts that those have on their student outcomes, either through formative assessments or through summative assessments. Now, once you get to the step 3 piece, then really it's a matter of, okay, now that we know what the problem is that we're addressing, we have some hypotheses that we've determined are true or valid. Now let's look at some action steps. So we want to have a combination of different types of actions to consider. What are we going to do to prevent these problems from occurring in the future? What can we do to teach appropriate replacement behaviors, or in this case, maybe sometimes the expectations a little bit better? And how do we continue to reinforce students' use of the appropriate behaviors that we'd like to see? And so there are different strategies that we can begin to then employ within each of these kinds of focus to ensure that we have a comprehensive approach to making sure that students are reducing their problem behaviors and engaging in more pro-social behaviors. And when we think about the development of those action steps, particularly at Tier 1, where we have a lot of people involved and we want to get a lot of our stakeholders participating in the actions, it really helps to have a lot of detail in your plan. Detailed plans set the stage for accountability and further support fidelity of the actions you're going to take. So fidelity here is still going to be an issue. We have some action steps that we've created in order to improve our Tier 1. And so now we want to put these actions into place. We want to make sure that we're monitoring to see that those actions are actually happening. And of course, then we're continually monitoring for student progress through our monthly data chats and reviews. So having put those actions into place to improve our tier 1, now we can come back and start to ask ourselves, did we improve our fidelity? Did we improve our discipline data? And if yes on both of those, then what is our next steps? If we did not get the improvements in our student data that we'd like to see, then it comes back to, well, did we do our action items the way we're supposed to with fidelity? If not, let's go ahead and shore those items up and get better fidelity of those action steps. And then let's see if we have more improvement in our data. In some cases, you might find that yes, you have implemented everything that you wanted to with fidelity for your action plan, and you've seen an uptick or an improvement in your discipline data, but not enough for you to be happy with it or to have a healthy core. Remember, again, at Problem ID, there were a lot of different patterns we looked at. There are a lot of potential priorities that we could have made. We chose one, we built a plan, we put it in place, and we got some improvements based on that. Well, now we can go back to that list of priorities, or maybe even find some new ones in current data, and then again, continuously improve our tier 1 by tackling these issues one at a time. This document here is available for you in the file share pod in our Zoom account. And this is just an example of how your team, as you're looking at your data, you're developing tier 1 improvement strategies and plans, and you're putting those into place and you're monitoring the fidelity of those as well as the student impacts. Now your team has to make some decisions. And we want teams to understand that this is going back to that medical analogy. I was given an antibiotic for 10 days. I only used it for 5. My symptoms came back. It's really not right for me to blame the antibiotic for not working. Instead, I really have to consider whether or not fidelity has to be improved before I can make a decision about impacts. But if we have good impacts and high fidelity, maybe we're at a place to start fading out or change goals or otherwise change focus. But certainly we want to celebrate success and document what works. Some cases we have low fidelity, where we have kind of some improvements, but not enough, or we have no improvement at all. And certainly in those two conditions, the very first thing to consider is improving the fidelity so that we can get to a better place to make decisions about impacts. So just a reminder, these data systems that we've shared with you are available for your schools to use. The one exception, of course, is our RTIB database. That is something that we would certainly encourage you to reach out and talk to us about if you'd like to get involved in that. And we have personnel ready to assist you in getting your schools set up to use that data system. So in summary, again, we definitely want to know what you want to know. The problem ID piece, of course, in particular is what I'm thinking about here. Understand that this is a continuous improvement cycle. Year after year, we're going to make small gains and small improvements so that we can get to the place of effective tier 1 outcomes for our students. And that occurs through the comparison of our fidelity data and our outcome data and continuing to boost our fidelity of our tier 1 practices and look to see the impacts it has on our student outcomes. We can also look at additional sources of data that can assist us in also further enhancing our priorities or otherwise digging into some hypotheses around why we think our referrals are happening the way they are. And we can also then use the same information to address not only student-focused issues, but also systems issues. In the area of fidelity of practices, if we find that some teachers are not engaging in the reward recognition system, or they're not using the transition procedures for cafeteria that we developed, whatever that might be, we can spot those in real time and provide technical assistance and coaching supports for staff to help them to support the fidelity of our practices. So all throughout this process, of course, at every moment and every month, as your teams are looking at your data and coming up with action items month to month to further enhance and improve your system for tier 1, remember though, we want to keep your stakeholders involved, keep them engaged, and always keep soliciting input from them as to how well they feel like the work is making a difference. So with that, I'm just going to close and turn it over to Betsy to take care of some exit procedures.
Oh, sorry. Thank you so much, Brian and Heather, for such an awesome presentation today. If you guys wouldn't mind sticking around for just a minute and just answering one more poll, just giving us some feedback on how the presentation was today. And you can just put that into the box. And we have a chat pod, so if there are any other questions that you'd like to ask in these last remaining few minutes, please feel free. Otherwise, please make sure that you download those resources that you saw. And thank you again. We hope to see you at our next chat, which is going to be on February 25th. And it is going to be a chat called, Does PBIS Work? What does the research say? So it will help you to combat some of those naysayers with some good information in hand to be prepared for those difficult conversations. So we hope you can join us on February 25th for that. And Heather, did you have anything else to add?
I don't. Thank you, everybody, but we can stick around in case you have more questions in the chat box.
And I will go ahead and repost those resources again, because it does look like someone wants them. So we'll be around for a couple minutes in the chat pod. Thank you guys so much for participating today.